So now we move into the third part of the day, which will focus on the demand-side constraints and solutions. Basically, what's happening on the employer side when it comes to hiring and keeping women in the workforce. To dive deeper into this, we will hear from Lisa Ho, postdoctoral associate, Yale Economic Growth Center with Inclusion Economics. As Rohini Pandey mentioned in her keynote earlier today, Lisa's research is on something many of us instinctively know, but now have data for. How maternity leave policies, while important, can have unintended consequences on women. So please put your hands together to welcome Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Suhani and the conference organizers for inviting me. And thank you for the very nice introduction. So I'm Lisa Ho, and I'm currently a postdoc at Yale University. And today I'll be talking about a research project that examines the employment effects of an extended maternity leave mandate in India that went into effect in 2017. So this is a project that's joint work with Garima Sharma, who's at Northwestern University, and Shreya Tandon, who's at Harvard University, as well as Pulak Ghosh at IIM Bangalore and Stephanie Howe at Revelio Labs. So we were motivated to study this question by some of the patterns in the data that Professor Pandey highlighted during her keynote lecture this morning. So participation in the labor force is particularly low, somewhat puzzlingly, among women in India who are more educated and among women who live in urban areas. So approximately 40% of women in rural areas are in the labor force compared to only 25% of women who live in urban areas. Similarly, labor force participation doesn't increase with education, which is surprising given that we would think people with more skills have higher potential wages if they were to enter the labor market. Education is actually highest for women with below a primary education and lowest for women who have a secondary education. This is all women who are outside of the labor force entirely, so women who are not looking for work. Once we look within the labor force, so at women who are trying to get employment but are unable to get it, we see that unemployment rises with education and that a huge gender gap emerges in unemployment, particularly at the level of tertiary education. So for people who have a tertiary education, 10% of men are unemployed compared to 21% of women. So there's a huge group of women who are unemployed, who are tertiary educated, who have a tertiary education and kind of have the skills to work. So that raises this question of if these urban women are highly educated, they have the required skills to work, and they're actually out there looking for jobs, they want to work, what's stopping them? A lot of the literature in academic literature recently has focused on labor supply factors, and what we want to look at in the study is consider more the role of the demand side and consider employers' decisions to hire men versus hire women. And so in this paper, what we'll look at is the decisions that firms face when there's an increasing cost of hiring female workers relative to hiring similar male workers. In particular, we're looking at a landmark change to formal sector employment for women that was passed in India in 2017, which was this amendment to maternity leave policy that extended the length of mandated leave that firms had to offer from 12 weeks to 26 weeks. This was described kind of by policymakers as a labor supply lever. So it described as a way to keep women in the labor market after childbirth by making it easier for them to return to work after they'd given birth. This actually made India the third most generous country in paid maternity leave, behind only Canada and Norway at the time. In considering the policy effects, though, they did not necessarily seem to anticipate a strong demand-side response, so a strong response from employers. But if employers react to the increased price of female workers, that could undo any response from the workers' side of being more willing to work. So in this paper, we look at the short-term impacts of the reform on young women's labor market outcomes. The data that we're using is from the Employee Provident Fund organization. So this is the organization that takes Social Security contributions, and that means that we can see all formal sector workers who earn 15,000 rupees or less per month. To study this, we'll use an empirical strategy called the difference in differences strategy, where we basically compare outcomes for women versus male workers before and after the reform at firms that were already offering the more generous 26 weeks of leave versus firms that were not previously offering the generous weeks of leave and so had to change their policies at the firm in response to the policy change passed in Parliament. Our main results that we find will be that there's an approximately 5% decline in women's employment, even just 6 months after the reform went into effect in 2017. And we find that the effect is concentrated on young women, who you might say are kind of most at risk of childbirth from the employer's perspective and having to actually take a maternity leave that would be costly. In contrast, we see no effect on employment of men. So to give you a little bit of context for those who are not familiar, family leave policies in India apply to all establishments, formal sector establishments, with 10 or more employees. Initially, there was a Maternity Benefit Act passed in 1961, which guaranteed 12 weeks of paid leave. And then there was no change to maternity leave policy, or no major change, until 2016-2017, when Parliament decided to pass a law, first in the upper house and then in the lower house, that the length of weeks that firms had to offer got extended from 12 weeks to 26 weeks. And that went into effect in April 2017. A key question here, kind of economically, is who is actually paying the wages, who's paying for maternity leave. And that remained the same both pre and post reform. So for workers who are earning less than 15,000 rupees per month, and that's the set of workers who we're looking at here, the salary is paid by the Employee State Insurance Corporation. But for the employer, they still have to pay the cost of losing this worker for an additional 14 weeks and having to find a replacement. So it still increased the cost of hiring a female worker relative to a similar male worker. What we do is this difference in difference is designed to estimate the causal impact of the maternity leave amendment on labor market outcomes. And we'll kind of run our analysis at the establishment level, looking month by month. And we'll look at firms that were already offering 26 weeks of leave before the reform compared to firms that had to change their policies, that they had to now offer 26 weeks when previously they wanted to offer less maternity leave to workers. We allow for differences between firms that were offering more leave versus less leave pre and post reform. And we also kind of control for time trends just because they're across different industries, there are kind of different trends in employment over time. What we then do is try to look at what the treatment effects are, and those will be what are plotted on the next slide, in the time periods relative to when the reform was passed in March 2017. So our set of control establishments, so the places that we say are unaffected by the reform, are those that were already offering 26 weeks before the law was passed. Okay, so this is showing our first set of results, which is that the reform decreased women's employment by approximately 5% just 6 or 7 months after the reform was passed. So on the left side, you see the months kind of before the reform, and you can see that relative to the month before the reform, employment for women was approximately level. Whereas after the reform was passed, the first 2-3 months, we don't see any effect, but then we start to see a decline in women's employment up through months 6 or 7. And this, in terms of magnitudes, is about a 5% decline in overall women's employment. In comparison, we see no effect for male workers. So both before the reform, before time period 0, and after the reform, we see just a flat line. So it doesn't seem like employers stop hiring women workers and then start hiring male workers. They just seem to cut back on employment overall. And so the size of these establishments shrinks in terms of number of workers, and there are fewer women relative to male workers after the reform is passed relative to before. We also look differentially by worker age. So we might expect, if this is driven by employers' concerns that women are going to give birth and they're going to leave, that this would be kind of concentrated on women who are most at risk of childbirth. And consistent with this, we find that the effect is entirely concentrated on women who are kind of younger workers, aged 18 to 35. When we look at women who are 35 years or older, we actually don't see any negative employment effects for them. So this really seems to be driven by workers who employers worry might want to take the maternity leave and be gone for 26 weeks. Okay, so just to conclude, what we find from the effects of this policy to maternity leave that made women workers essentially more expensive relative to male workers is that in the short term, extending the length of mandated leave decreased female employment by 5%, and that effect was concentrated on women of childbearing age. and there was no substitution to male workers. There was just an overall decrease in employment. So in terms of implications for policy, it seems like one kind of takeaway is that we should consider both the labor supply side, so workers deciding to work, as well as the demand side, so what employers' decisions are in their hiring when considering responses to policy changes. And related to what has been discussed on other panels, policymakers, it makes sense for them to think about how these reforms not only affect the decisions of workers to work or not work, but how they might affect the business case for hiring female workers. Thanks so much.